Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Vengeance Demon Hunter in Dragonflight. Vengeance Demon Hunters are kind of like the Swiss Army knife of tanks. They do a little bit of everything, and that all adds up to a really well-developed, complete tank. It does a mix of single target and AoE damage in its base rotation. It does a mix of proactive damage mitigation and reactive self-healing. It has defensive cooldowns you want to use proactively to mitigate damage, and defensive cooldowns you can use reactively when your health unexpectedly drops low. It also just has a humongous health pool. It also has AoE and single target offensive cooldowns now. And on top of all of that, it's a relatively easy class to play. Generating threat, especially AoE threat, is very easy. It's just built into the core rotation, really. You don't have to do anything fancy to pick up mobs at the start of pulls. Despite how much power the class provides, there's not actually that many abilities, resources, or cooldowns to monitor and use either. It's a relatively simple tank, especially when you compare it to the high end of complexity, tanks like Monk and DK. I've called Demon Hunter the total package in every single video I think I've made about him thus far, and it's true, I'm going to do it again. They're the total package. More than any other tank, they are completely well-rounded. They don't have even one single weakness. They aren't the best at everything, but they are good at everything. Genuinely a flawless tank. The total package. On that note, Demon Hunters are really strong. They're great in raids because they have huge health pools, which helps them deal with boss mechanics, or boss hits. Powerful percent damage reduction modifiers do the same thing, and it makes them good in Mythic Plus as well for dealing with spellcasts and good old auto attacks. They have insane mobility for dealing with movement mechanics in raids and in Mythic Plus, and they have good offensive and defensive cooldowns that are just good all the time. They deal lots of sustained and burst AoE damage. They have tons of self-healing. They have good AoE CC. They have good defensive cooldowns. And finally, they have a single target damage cooldown that's actually pretty good. Vengeance Demon Hunters are qualified to handle absolutely every possible tanking situation you could conceive of. Demon Hunter's tier set bonuses are simple, like most of the tier set bonuses in the first season of Dragonflight. The 2-piece bonus makes Fracture, your main Fury and Soul generator, generate 20% more Fury, 15% more Souls, and do 20% more damage. This is just a straight up buff to your damage and resource generation, and it's fantastic. The 4-piece bonus makes Spirit Bomb and Soul Cleave, which are your main resource spenders, have a chance to deal 50% more damage and make your enemies deal 15% less damage to you for 8 seconds. This is a great damage increase and a really good added defensive layer. It has about 20 to 30% uptime depending on haste and what you're tanking and, just good old RNG. This is a great pair of bonuses. They're simple, but they add a lot of defensive value without really having any sort of intrusion into your rotation or talent setup. I mean, technically the 2-piece adds resources, but that's a good thing. They both add damage, they both add defensive value. Legitimately just all positives. Now let's take a look at the talent tree. I have a couple of talent setups that I want to show off here, one for dungeons and one for raids. Alright, so now I'm looking at the Demon Hunter talent setup here, and I do have the Mythic Plus talent setup pulled up. First, I have technically 3 talent setups, but really one is a Mythic Plus one, one's a raid one. That'll be, most of the time, that'll be what you use in raid. And then for large-scale AoE and raid, I have one that's very similar to the Mythic Plus setup. It just has a couple of tiny little tweaks. Basically, you drop some utility for a little bit more throughput. So in the left side tree for Mythic Plus, you want to pick up some of these optional talents like Imprison and Consume Magic. You need them for pathing further down the tree to pick up and, improve Disrupt. Having more range on your interrupt is very nice. Just getting more crit chance on Aura of Pain is good, and it does synergize with Volatile Flame Blood over here in the right tree to give you a little bit more Fury, which is good. But the main thing here is that consume magic, being able to purge off magic buffs off of enemies, being able to CC enemies, this is just a very good utility to have in a Mythic Plus group. Similarly, I like to come over here to the right side of the tree and pick up Sigil of Misery and Concentrated Sigils, getting that extra duration. You know, you don't have to run Concentrated Sigils, you can run Precise. Either of those is fine, but I like the extra duration on your Sigils, you know, getting a little bit more damage value out of Sigil of Flame, but mainly getting more silence value out of Sigil of Silence. You don't have to come this way. You can path over through Pursuit, Master of the Glaive, and Chaos Nova. Completely acceptable. I don't really care for Chaos Nova. It's a 2-second AoE stun, which would be fine if it didn't have the associated 30 Fury cost, but that does make it pretty expensive, and it's I don't know, just a little annoying to me. Plus, you're coming over to the right side anyways to get Charred Warblades. Like, that is an obvious must-have talent on the way towards the bottom of the tree. So I would rather just spend the 2 remaining points to get Concentrated Sigils, which I'm going to want anyway. Or, again, Precise is fine. So really just 1 more point to get Sigil of Misery. That works. Down in the bottom section of the tree, you're going to want to pick up Quickened Sigils, The Hunt, and Collective Anguish. You're pretty much going to want those no matter what build you're running, what kind of content you're doing. Now, obviously, you can't have all of these at level 60, so if you are leveling as Vengeance, because you're not able to reach Elysian Decree initially, you know, your talents are going to look like more or less something along these lines while you're at level 60. Over on the right tree, you know, you don't pick up Elysian Decree for a while. You're probably not going to want to bothering with Quickened Sigils at first, so you probably would want your left tree to look something like this. And then as you progress through towards Quickened Sigils, you can also progress through and get Elysian Decree. Technically, you're going to want to get Elysian Decree as quickly as you can, so probably try to get that at level 67 or so. But you have to come over here to get Soul Crush and Soul Carver, so there you are. One notable talent that's useful while you're leveling is Relentless Pursuit. I don't necessarily think that this talent is all that useful once you're at max level, but getting cooldown reduction on the Hunt, which is a pretty huge damage cooldown, is good. You know, being able to pull a bunch of enemies and then slap the Hunt onto one of them, get all the rest of them dotted up, and then kill them rather quickly and get a bunch of cooldown reduction is okay. It's something, but pretty much only useful for leveling. This is more or less exactly how I want to set up my left side talent tree. Over on the right side, the main notable talents here are Spirit Bomb. Of course, this is really, really valuable for AoE damage. Soul Furnace is a pretty significant AoE damage as well. It basically just adds 40% damage to every second or third Spirit Bomb cast, which that adds up pretty quickly. You'll note that I've taken Painbringer. I think that this talent, even though it's a 2-pointer, which is kind of expensive, it's pretty good. It makes it so that every soul fragment you consume gives you 2% damage reduction for 5 seconds, and it stacks up. So when you're playing this Spirit Bomb build, you're always Spirit Bombing with 4 or 5 soul fragments up at a time. This basically means that Spirit Bomb is, in a sense, sort of a 8 to 10% damage reduction buff for 5 seconds on top of the healing and damage that it deals. That's pretty good. 8 to 10% damage reduction on top of all of the other defensive layers that you have available is pretty good. Now let's talk about some of those defensive layers. One of them is Calcified Spikes. Taking reduced damage after your Demon Spikes ends is very, very useful. Another one of those would obviously be Demon Spikes, your main active mitigation skill. Just a big old armor increase and parry increase. Very good for damage reduction. Yeah. Another one of those defensive layers is Frailty, which you're able to stack up multiple times thanks to Soul Crush. You apply a stack of Frailty to everything you hit with Spirit Bomb or Soul Cleave, and, you know, by being able to Spirit Bomb and then dump some more Fury with Soul Cleave, you're able to get quite a few stacks out onto enemies. It does stack and overlap with itself, much in the same way that Painbringer stacks and overlaps, and then they have independent timers. Frailty works the same way. You do have a couple of optional talents over here. Burning Blood is one of the most noteworthy ones. You have to take either Extended Spikes, which is a bit more, well, clearly more of a defense-focused option. It gives you more demonic spikes uptime. That's it. Defense only. Or you can take Burning Blood, which deals more, makes you deal 10% more fire damage. Fire damage is only about half of what you deal, but that's still about 5% more damage, which is not bad. Either way, you want to come down here and get Volatile Flame Blood. It gives you quite a lot more Fury generation, especially in AoE. It's just very easy to proc it on that 1 second internal cooldown. And yeah, kind of good synergy between Burning Blood and Volatile Flame Blood, and then Aura of Pain over here. Just adding a lot of extra value onto having Immolation Aura up as much as you possibly can. Notably, I didn't take Last Resort. You can drop 1 point out of Painbringer and take that. Maybe you want to put that point somewhere else entirely. There's not really a lot of other good options in this top part of the tree, though. The only other thing that I could really say, if you wanted to take that second point out and put it somewhere, would be Meteoric Strikes, and that's pretty much only useful for having, more mobility, which is good in raids. It's not bad in Mythic Plus, I just don't feel like it's quite as mandatory, and I think that I actually just get more sustained defensive value, or I know that I get more sustained defensive value out of Painbringer, and I would rather have that than the extra defensive layer of Last Resort most of the time. If I'm taking content that I feel is pretty difficult, pretty challenging, then I probably would take Last Resort. Maybe I would take a point out of somewhere else. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard to find another spot to give up to get Painbringer. Basically, the only other spot would be Soul Furnace. I guess you could do that, but it is kind of a pretty big defense or DPS loss, which then adds into your defenses because you do leech so much, of your healing comes from leech. So, generally thinking, this is more or less the setup. Now let's compare raid single target. It's really not very different, as you can see over here on the right side. You do give up Spirit Bomb. You take Meteoric Strikes, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. Still taking Painbringer, still think that's a pretty great defensive layer, although instead of being sort of more of a burst of defensive value after you Spirit Bomb, since you don't have it and you're just steadily soul cleaving, more like just sort of a rolling, kind of up and down, a slow wave of more damage reduction that's up all the time. Again, not taking Last Resort, but it's absolutely an option. You could drop one of those Painbringer points. That would be fine. You could also drop the point in Meteoric Strikes to get Last Resort. That probably makes more sense most of the time on raid bosses. I think any time where you're having to do a lot of movement, you're going to want to have Meteoric Strikes. But otherwise, you could give it up and take Last Resort. It is quite a bit more useful defensively than, having Infernal Strike on that somewhat shorter cooldown. But 8 seconds is a lot of cooldown reduction for a movement skill as powerful as Infernal Strike. Notably, over here in the left tree, I have not bothered with either of these Sigils talents because adding 2 seconds onto their duration basically only affects Sigil of Flame when you're in raid. You're not taking Sigil of Silence, you're just taking Roaring Fire, which really isn't a good talent, but it's useful for pathing down to Burning Blood, which is a pretty good DPS increase. Other than that, the left side of the tree is mostly the same. I did skip Imprison and Consume Magic to pick up Unrestrained Fury. This just adds a little bit of quality of life. So does Pursuit, just adding a little bit of mobility increase. And then I like to pick up Darkness for raid just because it's a raid defensive cooldown. Why wouldn't you want to have it? But in Mythic Plus, I don't love this talent for a couple of reasons. I mean, the main one is just that it's a pretty short radius. It's hard to actually get your party members to come stand next to you. And then even if you are able to, it's a chance to avoid damage. So it can be real hit and miss. And it's on a long cooldown and a short duration. Basically not a very good group defensive skill in parties, but it can be really good in raids. You can build comps up around using that and other defensive cooldowns at the same time, and it's pretty good. But as just a throw out there, hope your group stays alive in it in Mythic Plus, it's pretty hit and miss. And then just finally, for comparison, in raid AoE setup here, I have one where I just simply don't have Painbringer at all, running Spirit Bomb, using Meteoric Strikes and Last Resort, just sort of as a comparison to the other ones where I'm dropping, Meteoric Strikes and Last Resort to pick up Painbringer. I think that there is quite a bit of leeway in this. It's very much a do what you feel, basically. I probably won't run Last Resort most of the time. I would rather have the constant damage reduction, but you may disagree, and that's okay. Because this is a raid setup, I do want darkness, and I don't really care about Sigil of Misery, and that's pretty much all that's different from the Mythic Plus setup. Again, not taking Imprison, not taking Consume Magic in raid because don't feel like I need them. Now let's take a look at the main abilities you have as a Demon Hunter. Demon Hunter is like the epitome of the builder-spender playstyle that Blizzard has created for classes in WoW over the years. Actually, classes in a lot of their games. Diablo is a builder-spender game as well. You generate Fury and Souls with Fracture and Immolation Aura, and Sigil of Flame. Then you spend them with Spirit Bomb or Soul Cleave. How you spend your resources is dependent on whether or not you're using Spirit Bomb. If you're an AoE, Spirit Bomb will make you do a lot more damage. It is generally the better option to run defensively in AoE too, since so much of your self-healing comes from Leech. If you're Spirit Bombing, your main resource, the thing that changes how you use your abilities, is Soul Fragments. You want to Spirit Bomb when you're at 4 or 5 souls. The rest of your normal rotation will be built around getting up to that 4 to 5 soul mark so that you can use Spirit Bomb. If you're not using Spirit Bomb, so you're raid tanking, and you're just using Soul Cleave, then it's even simpler. You just generate Fury, then you spend it. That's it. In both setups, you want to make sure you're never wasting any resources. This means you don't want to let Fracture or Immolation Aura sit on cooldown, and you don't want to go over the cap of Souls or Fury. You don't want to use Soul Cleave and consume souls if you were using Spirit Bomb. You would want to save those souls for Spirit Bomb. You can still use Soul Cleave if you're using Spirit Bomb. It's worth keeping both bound. But the way you would do that generally is to generate Souls and Fury, use Spirit Bomb, then you've just Spirit Bombed, you're not, you ate all your souls up, so you quickly Soul Cleave a little bit of extra Fury away, and then you use more skills or cooldowns or whatever to generate more of the souls and Fury that you need to eat up with Spirit Bomb. And that's basically how you do your rotation. Generate the souls, gobble them up with Spirit Bomb, get out a quick Soul Cleave just as a little extra bit of Rage Dump or Fury Dump, and then back to fueling that Spirit Bomb machine. Your offensive cooldowns are mostly pretty simple. You have Fell Devastation, which is a combination of offensive and defensive cooldown, I guess. It also heals you for a bunch and grants you 6 seconds of Metamorphosis, your big defensive cooldown. So you kind of want to treat it like an AoE defensive cooldown, sort of. You want to Fell Dev as often as you can, really, because it is a good resource generator while you're in meta form, and it deals a good amount of AoE damage. Soul Carver is a single target damage cooldown that generates a large number of souls, 5 over a few seconds. Elysian Decree is an AoE damage cooldown that generates a good chunk of souls. The Hunt doesn't generate any souls, but it does deal a lot of damage and give you a massive amount of leech against the primary target for 30 seconds. In the case of all of these cooldowns, you want to try to get a few stacks of Frailty up on them before you pop your cooldowns. Frailty is one of your main defensive layers. It's a debuff you apply to your enemies, and it increases your damage output, grants you leech, and damage reduction against the target. You can stack Frailty on targets, although each stack has a duration that's independent of the other stacks. So you can roll stacks on an enemy, kind of up and down. You can roll them on groups of enemies, and they apply and fall off on their own independent 6-second timers. You get Frailty stacks in 3 ways. You can hit an enemy with a Sigil of Flame, you can hit them with Spirit Bomb, or you can hit them with Soul Cleave. Spirit Bomb and Soul Cleave apply an extra stack to your primary target. The Spirit Bomb playstyle generates fewer Frailty stacks because you're using Spirit Bomb a little less often than Soul Cleave. So even if you are doing the most you can to Spirit Bomb and then immediately use Soul Cleave and then go back to generating more souls for Spirit Bomb, you're still going to have a little bit less than you would if you're just playing straight Soul Cleave. It's okay in AoE. It's still worth using Spirit Bomb in Mythic Plus because it gives Demon Hunter a numerical reward for generating as many souls as you can. But in raids, you're better off sticking with the little bit more boring Soul Cleave build. Let's go over your main defensive skills now. You have Demon Spikes, which is a very simple active mitigation skill. You press it and your armor goes up. That's it. It's a really important defensive layer, and you should make good use of it whenever you're tanking. It's just incredibly simple. The worst thing you can do with Demon Spikes is not hit it enough. you will take a lot less damage whenever you have it up, so you should pretty much try to use it as much as you can whenever you're tanking. Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb are both self-heals, and the soul fragments they consume also heal you for a percentage of all the damage you've taken recently. It's a bit like Blood DK's Death Strike, although not nearly as strong, and not as big of a component of your core defensive toolkit. Your self-healing is important, it's just not the backbone of your ability to stay alive like Death Strike is. It's one ingredient in the stew along with Demon Spikes, Frailty, and your defensive cooldowns. As for your defensive cooldowns, you have Metamorphosis and Fiery Brand. Those are the two, and they are both very important. Fiery Brand is a single target defensive cooldown by default, and the talent setups that cause it to spread to other targets and be a stronger spell overall are fine, but they sacrifice a lot of continuous defensive value to get those bonuses, so I think generally that right side of the tree talent setup that gets those powers just isn't that competitive. Basically think of Fiery Brand as a big single target shield wall. It's good in raids with predictable boss damage hits, it's good in Mythic Plus for mini bosses or the actual bosses in Mythic Plus, but it's not usually very useful in AoE, and that's fine because your base rotation gives you so much damage mitigation and defensive value by default. Metamorphosis is your big defensive cooldown. It gives you a massive boost to health and to armor, so it's useful for basically any defensive purpose. It's good as a proactive skill to use before a big boss hit, it's good to use as a mitigation tool when you're about to take a bunch of damage from, say, a double or triple pull in a Mythic Plus, and it's good to use as a reactive defensive cooldown if your health suddenly drops low. You can also get Last Resort, which is a cheat death that triggers meta if you would have died on an 8-minute internal cooldown. Now let's talk about how to pull on a Vengeance Demon Hunter. This is something I wanted to go over because I know pulling packs and mobs can be difficult for new players. And this is one of the reasons that I recommend Demon Hunter so highly. Holding threat and AoE on a Demon Hunter is really easy. In general, you want to Infernal Strike into a pack, hit Demon Spikes and Immolation Aura as you're reaching the pack of enemies. If you have 4 or more souls, say they're pooled up from the pull before, or you jumped into like 10 guys and hit Immolation Aura and spawned 4 or more souls, you can Spirit Bomb right away. Otherwise, I would hit Fracture once, then Spirit Bomb, and then that's pretty much it. You got threat. Now you can just do your normal rotation. If you really want to get a little sweaty with it, you can open by putting a Sigil of Flame under your pack of enemies before you leap in. Basically, Sigil of Flame, then leap Demon Spikes and Immolation Aura and Spirit Bomb, and that works too. It's a little bit more sweaty to pull off, but only a tiny bit, and it's very effective for getting that opening burst of threat. Alright, in terms of stats, Demon Hunters want to enchant and gem for haste, and then versatility would be your second best secondary stat. Crit is pretty competitive with versatility for what it's worth. You parry a lot of attacks, and crit helps with that. It's technically a better damage reduction stat overall in Mythic Plus than versatility, but it's less consistent and it doesn't work against spells at all. You can't parry a spell. Versatility, you know, more consistency but less damage reduction overall. As always, you want to maximize your item level before you worry about secondary stats on pieces of gear. Always wear item level upgrades. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.